Welcome to another episode of The Wormhole. I am really excited about our guest today. And if you're into wildlife, you don't want to miss this conversation. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have Professor Stan Temple with us. Hello, Stan. Welcome to The Wormhole.
Hi, Sharon. Good to be with you.
Fantastic. The Wormhole allows us to connect with scholars all over the world. So I am located in Trinidad right now, while Stan, he is in the United States. So who is Professor Temple? Stanley Temple is the Beers Bascom Professor Emeritus in Conservation in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology and former chairman of the Conservation Biology and Sustainable Development Program in the Gaylord Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. For 32 years, he held the academic position once occupied by Aldo Leopold. And during that time, he won every teaching award for which he was eligible. He's currently a senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation. He has received major conservation awards from the Society for Conservation Biology, the Wildlife Society, and the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology. Among other recognitions of his achievements, he's a fellow of the American Ornithologists Union, Explorers Club, Wildlife Conservation Society, and American Association for Advancement of Science. He has been the president of the Society for Conservation Biology and chairman of the board of the Nature Conservancy in Wisconsin. He has authored over 320 articles and 7 books. Very interestingly, he notes, as a precocious young bird watcher paging through nature books, I discovered many fascinating birds that I would never see because they had gone extinct before I was born, and I felt cheated. Why had previous generations let these species disappear? And why hadn't they done more to prevent these irreversible losses? I promised that when my turn came, I would have something to say and do about that travesty. Today, he is proud to list several bird species once on the brink of extinction that have rebounded in part because of his efforts. Folks, it's a real honor to have as a guest with us today, Professor Stan Temple. So did you always want to be a wildlife biologist?
Well, probably not always, but certainly as a young boy, I was fascinated with nature, spent as much time as I could out of doors. I was somewhat notorious for being truant in school when nature beckoned more than the classroom. But by the time I was at university and started to understand more about the options that were available for someone like me who cared deeply about nature and wanted to make a difference. In my case, the most attractive option seemed to be combining the science of ecology and the practice of conservation. So I did become a wildlife biologist or conservation biologist.
So from your childhood, it appears it was the one path for you. And certainly you have made a tremendous impact, as we heard just earlier on. So what are some of the projects that you've been engaged in that have been close to your heart?
Well, you know, there's an old saying that you never forget your first. And the first conservation project that I had sort of ownership of was on the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. Mauritius being infamous in conservation circles as the former home of the dodo. But I was there to work on some endangered species, especially the Mauritius kestrel, which at the time was the rarest bird in the world. When I estimated the population, it reached a low point of just 6 birds, 4 in the wild and 2 that I'd taken into captivity. That was in 1972, and here we are 50 years later. And this month, the Mauritius kestrel was named the national bird of Mauritius because there are now well over 300 of these birds, and the success story of its conservation was quite inspiring to the nation.
That is a fantastic story. I can only imagine what it must have been like for you because we're talking about less than 10. This could have actually gone either way. So, was it a very difficult process getting this to, as you say, 50 years later in the number of hundreds today, and it's now being the national bird? How do you go about getting them to rebound the way you did?
Well, it was controversial from the very start because there were many in the conservation community who said it's a hopeless cause. Why are we spending money on a species that clearly is going to go extinct? Fortunately, there were others who thought we had a good chance at it. But yeah, the big challenge, of course, right from the start is that we began with so few birds. So this was a species that had already gone through a serious population bottleneck, had lost a lot of its genetic diversity, and was very vulnerable to stochastic events, sort of random events that could have made a huge difference with so few birds to work with. But it's a good illustration that when you try to turn things around for a seriously endangered species, it does take a while. It's not something that happens overnight. So in this case, it was literally 50 years before we could be confident enough to have it declared a national bird.
But that absolutely gives a lot of hope for even other projects and to have that type of long-term vision and patience to make it and for you to be able to see it rebound. I can only imagine how exciting that is for you. And as I read that little quote from you where you said that you wish there were birds that you saw in books that you would have been able to see, but they're gone forever. So, Stan, you have journeyed all over the world to a remarkable number of countries, and you even ended up in Trinidad. Tell us about that. How did you end up in Trinidad?
Well, it was fairly late in my active career, and I was growing frustrated to some extent that my work with endangered species and other conservation issues often had a lifespan that was dictated by the duration of a grant or a contract. I had a list of criteria, what I wanted the place to be. I wanted it to be a high biodiversity place with some real opportunities to preserve that biodiversity. It would be nice if it was a place that had a fairly limited culture of conservation so that I could make a real contribution. It would be practical for it to be perhaps a smaller country where I could really get to know the place. It would certainly be helpful if it was English speaking and that there was a university there that I could affiliate with and definitely. And by process of elimination, the University of the West Indies was the university. Trinidad was the place. I worked there from 1994 to 2005.
Oh, that's remarkable. As you were giving your story, I'm like, yes, check. We did check all the on the checklist that was important for you to convert to spending some time in Trinidad. So, in your time in Trinidad, what were some of the species that you found interesting that you worked with?
Well, I tried to do a bunch of things that weren't necessarily just focused on a species. You really don't have that many severely endangered species in Trinidad because for a variety of reasons, Trinidad and Tobago still have a large portion of their land area in natural cover, and most of the species are not severely endangered. So my focus wasn't on severely endangered species this time. It was more on training young conservationists who could carry on the work. And I did that through teaching at the University of the West Indies. I worked with many of the conservation organizations that were sort of fledgling groups at the time to try to strengthen their ability to do conservation work. I worked with government agencies, especially the wildlife section, to try to, again, strengthen their ability to do conservation work. So it was more of a broad effort rather than focused on an individual species.
I'm really happy to hear that in Trinidad that birds and so on are not as endangered as you would get them in other places. So Stan, as we move on, trying to understand all the paths that your life has taken, did you have any defining moments in your life that brought you in your career to where you are today? Things that just stand out.
Oh, absolutely. And probably like many individuals, serendipity played a huge role. There were events that affected me that I had no inkling that they were going to have such a lasting effect. At a very young age, I was fortunate enough to have as one of my adult mentors, Rachel Carson, who became a very famous individual for her book, Silent Spring, that sort of introduced the world to the dangers of agricultural chemicals. But probably the major turning points came when I was in high school. And the Cleveland Museum of Natural History had just moved from a century old building to a brand new modern facility. And the museum had pretty much emptied the bank account getting the building started, and they didn't have a lot of money for hiring staff. So the director of the museum had this brilliant idea that he was going to look around the city of Cleveland and try to identify a handful of high school students who seemed to have a lot of potential to be professionals in the field. And I was lucky enough to be chosen as one of those individuals. So I spent my high school years working at the Cleveland Museum, where I was given responsibilities just way beyond my years. But it was a tremendous boost, as the director of the museum hoped it would be, that sort of launched me into my eventual career. But the actual focus on endangered species and biodiversity came while I was at university, at Cornell University. I participated in a seminar, and as a result of that seminar, I reviewed the first red data book for birds, the first international catalog of endangered species. And I was somewhat horrified to see how many birds were so severely endangered and looked as though they were going to go extinct. The professor who was in charge of the seminar liked my presentation, and he said, "You should really share your paper with the World Wildlife Fund and the International Council for Bird Preservation," which I did. And I got a polite letter: "Thank you, very interesting. Don't call us, we'll call you." 5 years later, out of the blue, as I was wrapping up my PhD work, the International Council for Bird Preservation called and said, "We've received a gift that's earmarked for conservation work on the rarest birds in the world. And some of the birds that you wrote to me about 5 years ago were among the rarest birds in the world, including the Mauritius kestrel. How would you like to use this funding to put your ideas into practice?" So I was off to the Indian Ocean to work on some of the world's rarest bird species. And that obviously was a major defining moment, because it established my career as someone who could be trusted to sort of steer a recovery program for endangered species in a successful direction.
What a wonderful story, Stan. And I think the key word that you use, serendipity, you can actually see specific events. That is remarkable, that the paper that you chose to send, and then 5 years later, it actually bore fruit unknown to you.
There's a lesson there for students, to take every opportunity you can to network, because you never know how those connections are going to pay off for you.
When I introduced you, I mentioned that you are connected with the Aldo Leopold Foundation. Tell us a little bit about it and your role in it presently. And perhaps for some of our audience, who was Aldo Leopold?
Aldo Leopold was probably the most influential conservation thinker in the Western world, and perhaps in the entire world. He lived from 1887 to 1948, and during his lifespan really spanned the emergence of the modern conservation field, and he contributed a lot to it as that field developed. He's probably most noted and well known around the world now for a book that he wrote at the end of his life called A Sand County Almanac. And in that book, he expressed frustration that a lot of the things that he had tried to get conservation started hadn't really worked as well as he thought. And he was looking for a fundamental change in human behavior that might be the silver bullet, so to speak, to get people to change their relationship with the natural world. Definitely, he was one of the people that introduced a novel concept at the time, a very novel concept of ethics, that our relationship with the natural world had to have a moral compass. It had to have a code of ethics if we were going to live successfully on the planet. So I joined the Aldo Leopold Foundation when they formed in 1982 as their science advisor. And when I retired from academia in 2008, I continued my relationship with them as a senior fellow, where basically I do a lot of outreach and writing for them.
It's wonderful to hear how that would be almost over 100 years ago when one looked at the environment, and it takes an individual to realize that some of the things that we now take for granted, the importance of how we live in harmony with our environment, was actually not there. It was interesting to hear you talk about the role of ethics in dealing with things like that. So just a little while ago, we talked about your path in your career, which led to serendipity, and you did mention Rachel Carson. And but were there other heroes or even mentors that you met along the way that influenced you in your thinking and the path that you've taken?
Well, certainly Rachel Carson was a very important individual because I was quite young then when I first met her. We ended up meeting each other on birdwatching hikes with the local Audubon Society. She certainly instilled in me a sense of curiosity and a sense of wonder about the natural world. Aldo Leopold was also a very important influence on me. I read his book, A Sand County Almanac, when I was in high school. Was fortunate when I was an undergraduate at Cornell University to have one of Leopold's graduate students as my academic advisor. So I really related to this guy and really understood what he was getting at in his book, A Sand County Almanac. And it was a great inspiration to me. And for me, I'll never forget the first time I opened that book as a teenager, and I read the opening words of the book that just completely resonated with me. Leopold said there are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. And I immediately knew that I was one of the cannots.
That's really powerful. And as you say, those opening lines stayed with you. I have not at this point read that book, but you can be sure as soon as our interview is over, it's going to be in my cart to be bought. So definitely a very important book for all of us and all our viewers to take a look at. And one of the things that you said that when you were in Cornell, and then, well, the importance of mentors along the way. What came to my mind, and what's interesting hearing you talk about in your field of biology and me being in astronomy, how many similar paths there are. You mentioned the word curiosity, and I'm like, that's what astronomy is all about. So we see that in academia, all these threads that go through it. And you were in Cornell, and I'm just throwing this out. One of my mentors and heroes was, and most people who have heard me talk would probably be mouthing it right away, was of course Carl Sagan. And I wondered, did you at all have an opportunity to perhaps meet with Carl Sagan? As you mentioned, you were at Cornell.
Well, I certainly did. He lived next door to me, and our paths crossed on a number of occasions. I'm a falconer, and some of my trained birds of prey would end up in his yard. And so we first met that way, but because we were living next door to one another, we often were on a similar schedule walking to campus. So I got to have casual conversations with him as we walked to campus together. Yeah, a very interesting person, and again, very inspiring, not just to astronomers, but to anyone who's curious about our place in the universe.
Absolutely. Well, Sam, I am envious. I'm envious. That must have been quite an experience. As we mentioned Carl Sagan, I know there's a quote by him that's dear to you, and I'm going to actually read it now. And it says, well, from him, Carl Sagan, our species needs and deserves a citizenry with minds wide awake and a basic understanding of how the world works. Most people immediately associate Carl Sagan with astronomy, and here you, as a biologist, can see depth in one of his quotes. How does it appeal to you?
Well, I have, of course, come to realize that there are these many sort of intractable problems that we face in trying to live successfully on this planet. And it's become clear to me that the roots of many of these intractable problems is either ignorance or in many cases willful denial of indisputable truths about how we're living on this planet. And clearly, as Carl Sagan hinted in this quote that I've used quite often, knowledge and understanding of how the world works is maybe a first necessary step to understanding how to live responsibly on the planet. So that was my reason. I have great faith in the ability of science to figure out how the world works and for that to show us the way forward.
Absolutely. And the need for persons like yourself and others in academia to be able to see, even as Aldo Leopold did, where the issues and problems are. So with that in mind, and you have the benefit of hindsight, what change would you like to see in the world, given where we are currently and where we've come from?
Well, I've taken a very broad, holistic view of what I'd like to see changed, and it relates to understanding those fundamental truths about how we live on the planet. So, I tend to focus on the sort of fundamental systemic problems that are degrading our home here on the planet. So I would certainly like to see fewer human beings on the planet. I'd like to see them consuming resources more sustainably. And I'd certainly like them to rely a lot less on environmentally damaging technologies. Those to me seem to be the fundamental systemic problems that are behind almost all of our conservation challenges, everything from sort of big global issues like climate change and biodiversity loss to local issues, all seem to relate to those three problems.
So as you look back from where things were a couple of decades ago, do you see that we're moving in a positive direction, or there is still a lot to be done?
Well, there certainly is a lot to be done. And I've come to realize, of course, that being successful at conservation, it's an affair of the heart as well as the mind. Science and facts and knowledge alone don't always lead to changes in our behavior unless we have a moral compass, if you will, that leads us to care about the planet. So when I think about, where we're going, I'm very hopeful because we basically have a pretty good idea of what needs to be done. The facts are there, they're undeniable. So we know what to do. The big hurdle is how to convince people to actually get on with it and do it.
You mentioned some important terms there, the value of emotion, and actually it made me think of, I know, another quote that's very dear to you, which I will just go ahead and share with our audience. This particular quote by Sagan J. Gould, and he said, "We cannot win this battle to save species and environments without forging an emotional bond between ourselves and nature as well. For we will not fight to save what we do not love." And in a way, I think that's what you just expressed, Stan, the importance of caring emotionally for our environment. And that can bring all of us as humanity on board to living in harmony with the wild. All right, so I'm going to ask you a hard question. One word to describe life on planet Earth.
Threatened.
Okay, all right. I wanted to see which direction, where would that fall? And a very deep word indeed. And certainly, I think what would have taken you on your journey in which you have worked so hard and tirelessly for the wildlife around us. So among your many stories of success, what has been some of your proudest moments?
Well, I think, if you care about your legacy and what your sort of image will be in the future, certainly one of the things I'm proudest of would be the many students that I've helped train and how many of them have gone on to make impressive contributions to conservation. In the instance of Trinidad and Tobago, I think of some of the Trinis that have taken their graduate degrees with me. Howard Nelson, who's now on the faculty at Cambridge University, or Nicole Leopold and Anka Granderson and Natalie Boudreau, who are the sort of ringleaders of the Caribbean Natural Resource Institute. These are individuals that are going to carry on my legacy, essentially, the things that they learned from me while they studied with me.
It's very interesting to hear you say Trini, because now it's like, I know he has been here. It's not common to hear others refer to us as Trinis unless you've been here. So you're quite on the board there. All right, so that whole idea of touching lives and it moves forward, it's fantastic because you said at one point in our discussion that one of your advisors was Aldo Leopold's graduate students. And I was thinking that in our line of work, we have academic family tree. So you can draw an academic family tree, which follows from advisors to students and advisors to students. And it's marvelous to see the continuity over 1,000 years, So as you talk about your students there, that comes to mind.
It's interesting that I've now been around long enough that I have academic grandchildren. And even
I love that.
Great.
Academic great-grandchildren, and that is something definitely to be very proud of. So having done so much in your life, is there anything that remains on your bucket list that you'd love to do still?
Well, I often regret that I've not taken as much time as I should have to experience that joy and sense of wonder that I experienced pretty early in my life. Too much of my time in reflection, too much of my time in nature has been working and not taking enough time to simply enjoy the experiences. So I'm looking forward to perhaps remedying that deficiency.
That's an interesting perspective from an academic, and you're right. One can easily get lost so much in the academic work that you lose the beauty of why you got into it sometimes in the first place. So what do you do for fun when you're not working?
Well, I guess the thing that I really do enjoy most is the time that I've been able to spend alone in nature. So, I enjoy exploring new environments. Some of my hobbies like bird watching and falconry and sailing and kayaking are all things that I can do in nature alone. Doesn't require a crowd. And most of those things give me a deep connection in some way with the natural world.
Okay, I can see when you're at one and at peace with the environment around you. That's marvelous, Stan. Well, Stan, on the Wormhole, we have a few signature questions that we ask all our guests, and I'm now going to throw them at you. And one of it, and I'll actually start with this one, and in a way you've answered it already, but you can give it another shot. What's one of your favorite books or movies, or book and a movie?
Well, yes, you're right. I did mention already that Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac has always been a very inspirational book. It's a book that you read over and over again. It's not one that you read once and put away on the shelf. And every time you read it, you find something new that this insightful individual understood about our relationship with the natural world. A few years ago, the Aldo Leopold Foundation did a documentary film about Aldo Leopold's life called Green Fire. And that movie, I guess, would have to go down as my favorite movie because it does very effectively tell the story of Aldo Leopold's life and especially his contribution about the land ethic and living ethically on the planet.
Well, I'm definitely noting it all down because I also got to catch up on that one. So, folks, the Green Fire, it definitely sounds like something that would be absolutely worth watching. And I look forward to doing that. Thank you, Stan, for that recommendation. And another question, another what we call signature questions. What thought or idea or invention, it could be anything, not necessarily in your own field, blows your mind away?
Well, I suppose you could look at that in either a positive way or a negative way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'll take the negative way. At several points in my career as a conservationist, I've encountered philosophical oppositions to conservation projects. And it was based on an idea that blew my mind, that concerns about individual organisms are more important than concerns about species or ecosystems. And for example, when I was working in the Indian Ocean, we launched a program to try to eradicate introduced rabbits that were devastating this small island that was populated by dozens of unique endemic species that were found nowhere else in the world. And opponents to this program blew my mind by stating that they would rather allow all the unique plants and animals on this island to go extinct than countenance the killing of introduced rabbits. That blew my mind that someone would think that a small number of rabbits were more important than these unique species. And later in my career, in a similar sort of way, my mind was blown by some who took a position on the California condor, which was one of the more endangered birds in North America that we were trying to save with a captive breeding and reintroduction program. And the opposition thought that it was far better to let the last California condor die free in the wild than have the remaining birds removed from the wild and taken into captivity. Well, in both cases, I guess you could say my view won. We eventually did get rid of the rabbits on Round Island in the Indian Ocean, and we did take the last California condors into captivity. And there are now, of course, hundreds of California condors in the wild as a result of the success we had at captive breeding and reintroduction.
As you say, having the birds come back through conservation efforts, they're all now free. So importantly, I'm very happy that you fought against these opposition and have helped planet Earth. So on the topic of, and you're a biologist, and but one of the questions we do ask all our guests, and is, I'm very anxious to hear what you would say to this one, that if you could be any animal in a magical world, what would you choose to be?
Well, as you might guess, I suppose it's going to be a species that I know particularly well, so that I'm not making a mistake by picking a species that I might regret. So I think maybe I would like to be a peregrine falcon. Peregrine falcons have characteristics that I greatly admire. They're one of only 3 bird species that are cosmopolitan, that are found everywhere in the world, of course, including Trinidad. They're absolutely the pinnacle of evolution in the mastery of the air. They're the fastest bird on wing. They've proven to be very resilient in the face of lots of problems that we've created for them. They're a very beautiful bird, and perhaps most important, they're an example of a conservation success story. They were once endangered by pesticides like DDT, and by banning DDT and through a program that I was very much involved with captive breeding and reintroduction, peregrine falcons are no longer on the endangered list.
That is just marvelous. So I tried to guess and I'm like, I wonder what Stan would say. So I said it would be a bird, but I love the specific bird you picked, and it sort of embodies you. Like you said, they're all over the world, even in Trinidad. All right. So Stan, just one last question that I'm going to throw out at you. It's not really a question, more your philosophical statement of what would be your message to the world?
Well, given the field that I'm in, don't allow yourself to become too pessimistic, and especially don't give up. To always remain hopeful that we can make a difference individually and collectively, and make the world a better place. And I suppose one of the goals of that I always tell people is to be a good ancestor, to leave this planet in at least as good a condition as it was when you entered it.
I love your message of being a good ancestor. You don't often hear it in that kind of context. And of course, Professor Temple has been a living legacy of all that you have just said. Professor Temple, it has been such an honor to have you as a guest on this show. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we've really loved having you.
Thank you, Sagan, for doing this interview. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
And you've definitely touched my life in our very short interaction. So thank you once again. And folks, this brings us to the end of another episode of The Wormhole, where we seek to find the answers to life, the universe, and everything. So I am your host, Sharon Hack, signing off from none other than Studio 42. So until next time, bye.